For 72 years, one man sat on the throne of France. That is the longest reign of any monarch in the history of Europe. He came to power as a 4-year-old boy who could barely speak in full sentences, and he died an old man in a gilded bed while the whole country waited outside his door. By the time he was gone, almost nobody alive in France could remember a time before him. He had outlived his own son. He had outlived his grandson. He had buried one heir after another, until the throne passed to a tiny great-grandson who was not even old enough to walk. His name was Louis XIV, and he was utterly convinced of one thing. He believed that God had chosen him personally to rule, and that his word was, quite simply, the word of France itself. If you are enjoying this, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Now here is a question I want you to sit with as we go. Imagine you are a young nobleman, invited to court for the first time, walking into a hall of mirrors lit by thousands of candles, and the most powerful man in the world turns to look at you. Would you have bowed or would you have frozen? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. This is the full story of how that boy became the Sun King. We are going to follow him from a near miraculous birth, through a childhood civil war that taught him to fear his own subjects, into the years where he seized total control of the most populous kingdom in Western Europe. We will see him build the most famous palace on earth, tame an entire aristocracy with nothing but social pressure, fight war after war, and make one religious decision that drove tens of thousands of his most useful people out of the country. By the end, you will understand not just what Louis did, but why a single human being came to believe he was the living center of the world. Let us start at the beginning, with a baby that almost nobody expected to be born at all, the God-given child. In the autumn of 1638, the King and Queen of France had been married for 23 years, and they had no children. This was not a small problem. It was a slow-burning national crisis. The king was Louis XIII, a cold and often sickly man. The queen was Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess by birth despite the confusing title. The two of them barely got along. For years, the royal couple had lived almost separate lives, and the lack of an heir meant that the crown was expected to pass to the king's ambitious younger brother, a man few people trusted to hold the kingdom together. Then, against the odds, Anne became pregnant. On the 5th of September, 1638, she gave birth to a healthy boy at the royal residence outside Paris. The relief across France was enormous. The child was given the name Louis, and people quickly attached a second name to him as well. They called him Louis Dieudonné, which means Louis the God-given. From his very first breath, the boy was wrapped in the idea that his existence was a gift from heaven. He was not raised by his parents in any normal sense. Royal children of the period were handed to a household of nurses, governesses, and servants. His father remained distant and was often ill. What mattered most for the future was the bond that formed between the boy and his mother, Anne. She adored him, and she would soon become one of the two people who effectively ran France in his name. A younger brother followed 2 years later, a boy named Philippe. The two would remain close their whole lives, though their roles were carefully kept unequal. From early childhood, everyone around Philippe made sure he understood that he was the spare, not the heir, and that he must never become a threat to his older brother's throne. That throne arrived much sooner than anyone planned. A boy king and 2 guardians. In the spring of 1643, Louis XIII died of a long illness. His son was 4 years old. A 4-year-old cannot rule a kingdom, so France needed a regent to govern until the boy came of age. The dead king had tried to limit his wife's power through his will, but Anne of Austria moved quickly. She had the will overturned and made herself sole regent, with full authority to act in her son's name. Anne did not rule alone. She leaned heavily on a man named Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin was Italian by birth, a smooth and brilliant diplomat who had risen as the protégé of the previous chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Mazarin became the real engine of the government, and his relationship with the Queen was so close that many people at the time assumed, probably correctly, that they were privately married or something very near to it. For young Louis, this meant that the two most important adults in his world were his mother and this clever foreign cardinal. Mazarin took charge of the boy's political education. He taught him how power actually worked, how to read people, how to wait, and how to strike. Louis would later say that he owed almost everything he understood about governing to those lessons. But the early years of the reign were not stable or comfortable. France was still deep in a long and expensive war against Spain and the Habsburg Empire. Taxes were heavy, the treasury was strained, and resentment was building at every level of society. The boy king was living off the surface of a kingdom that was starting to crack underneath him. When the crack finally opened, it nearly swallowed him. The Fronde. Between 1648 and 1653, France tore itself apart in a series of revolts known as the Fronde. The word comes from a child's slingshot, and it was meant to mock the rebels as troublemakers. But the Fronde was deadly serious, and it left a permanent mark on the king who lived through it. The trouble started with money and power. To pay for the war, Mazarin's government kept inventing new taxes and squeezing the people who held official posts. The High Court in Paris, called the Parliament, pushed back hard. These were not elected representatives in the modern sense. They were senior judges and officials who claimed the right to review royal decrees. They demanded limits on the crown's power to tax and arrest at will. When the government tried to silence the leaders of the parliament, Paris exploded. Citizens threw up barricades in the streets. The royal family was no longer safe in its own capital. In a moment that the young Louis never forgot, his mother and Mazarin had to flee the city with him in the middle of the night, slipping out in secret to escape the mob. The revolt then spread and changed shape. Great nobles, including princes of the royal blood, saw a chance to grab power from Mazarin and joined the chaos. For a few years, France fell into a confusing tangle of shifting alliances, private armies, and betrayals. At one point, even the king's own cousin turned cannon on royal troops in the streets of Paris. Eventually, the rebellion collapsed under its own divisions. The nobles could not trust each other, the public grew exhausted, and the crown slowly clawed back control. By 1653, Mazarin was firmly back in power, and the Fronde was over. For Louis, the lessons were burned in deep. He had been humiliated, frightened, and chased out of his own city by his own subjects. He concluded that an overmighty nobility was a mortal danger, that Paris was a nest of disorder, and that real security meant gathering all power tightly into the hands of the king. Every major decision of his adult life can be traced back, in part, to those terrifying childhood years. Coming of age and a Spanish bride. As the Fronde faded, Louis grew into a young man, and the long war with Spain finally moved toward its end. In 1654, at the age of 15, Louis was formally crowned at the cathedral in Reims, the traditional site for the consecration of French kings. The ceremony was loaded with religious meaning. The king was anointed with holy oil, a ritual that presented him as a sacred figure standing between God and the people. For a young man already raised on the idea that he was God-given, this only deepened his sense of a divine mission. The war with Spain dragged on for a few more years, until both sides were exhausted. In 1659, France and Spain signed the Peace of the Pyrenees, a major treaty that ended decades of conflict and shifted territory and influence toward France. The deal was sealed, as royal deals usually were, with a marriage. The bride was Maria Teresa, a Spanish princess and Louis's own first cousin on both sides of his family. Such close royal intermarriage was normal at the time, even though we now understand how damaging it was to these bloodlines. The two were married in 1660. As part of the agreement, Maria Theresa renounced her claim to the Spanish throne in exchange for a large cash payment, a dowry that Spain, as it turned out, could not actually afford to pay. That unpaid promise would later give Louis a convenient excuse to make claims on Spanish lands. The marriage itself was not a love match. Louis treated his wife with public courtesy and private indifference, and he would spend much of his life openly involved with other women. Maria Theresa, for her part, remained quietly devoted to him and largely powerless. She gave him several children, though only one of them, a son also named Louis, survived into adulthood. The young king now had a crown, a queen, an heir on the way, and peace with his great rival. What he did not yet have was full control of his own government. That belonged to Mazarin, and Mazarin was about to die the day Louis took control. In March of 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. Louis was 22 years old, and what he did next set the tone for the rest of his reign. For decades, France had been run by a powerful chief minister, first Richelieu, then Mazarin. The natural expectation was that Louis would simply choose a new one. Instead, he called his council together and announced that there would be no more chief minister. From now on, he said, he would govern by himself. He would be his own first minister. Reports would come directly to him, decisions would flow directly from him, and no single servant would ever again hold the kind of power that Mazarin had held. The men around him assumed this was the enthusiasm of a young king that would fade within weeks. It did not fade. Louis worked at the business of government with a discipline that surprised everyone, sitting through long council meetings, reading reports, and keeping the threads of power gathered in his own hands. He genuinely enjoyed the work, and he kept it up, day after day, for more than 50 years. His first dramatic move was against a man named Nicolas Fouquet, the powerful superintendent of finances. Fouquet was rich, brilliant, and a little too pleased with himself. He had built a magnificent country house and threw a lavish party there to impress the king. The display was so extravagant that it may have looked less like flattery and more like a rival showing off. Within weeks, Louis had Fouquet arrested on charges of corruption. After a long and politically managed trial, Fouquet was imprisoned for the rest of his life. The message was unmistakable. No servant of the crown, however gifted, was safe if he gathered too much wealth or stood too tall. The king alone would shine. It is often claimed that Louis summed up his whole approach with the phrase, "The state is me." Historians doubt he ever actually said it, and it may be a later invention. But true or not, it captures the reality of what he built. He set out to make himself the single point through which all power in France would pass. Here is a small detail that says a lot about the man. Louis XIV had a famously enormous appetite, and after his death, the doctors who examined his body reportedly found that his stomach and intestines were about twice the normal size. He really did consume the world around him, in more ways than one. Colbert and the Machine of State. A king who wants to govern personally still needs talented people to carry out his will. Louis found his most important administrator in a hard-working, humorless official named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert had actually helped bring down Fouquet, and he stepped into the gap to take charge of France's finances and much more. For about 2 decades, he was the central figure in running the practical machinery of the kingdom. His goal was simple to describe and brutally hard to achieve. He wanted to make France rich, orderly, and self-sufficient, with the crown collecting as much of that wealth as possible. Colbert followed an economic approach often called mercantilism. The core idea was that the world contained a fixed amount of wealth, mostly measured in gold and silver, and that a nation grew strong by selling more abroad than it bought from abroad. To make that happen, Colbert pushed France to manufacture its own luxury goods instead of importing them. He supported new industries, set strict quality standards, founded trading companies to reach distant markets, and built up the navy and merchant fleet. He poured effort into roads, canals, and ports so that goods could move. One of his proudest projects was a great canal in the south of France that linked the Atlantic side of the country to the Mediterranean, an enormous engineering feat for its day. He also went after the chaos in the king's accounts. The French tax system was a tangled mess of exemptions, sold offices, and local privileges. The wealthiest people, the nobility, and much of the clergy were largely exempt from the main direct tax, which meant the heaviest burden fell on the peasants and townspeople who could least afford it. Colbert could not tear this system down, since it was woven into the whole social order, but he worked relentlessly to make it collect more efficiently and to crack down on fraud. He even reshaped how France made beautiful things. He brought skilled craftsmen together in royal workshops, most famously a manufactory in Paris that produced tapestries and furniture of such quality that they advertised French taste across Europe. The idea was that luxury itself could be a tool of state power, drawing foreign money into France and binding the prestige of fine craftsmanship to the glory of the crown. Colbert also turned his energy on the law itself. French justice was a patchwork of overlapping local customs, ancient privileges, and contradictory rules that varied from region to region. Under his direction, the government issued a series of great ordinances meant to bring order and uniformity to whole branches of the law, including civil procedure, criminal justice, commerce, and the management of forests and waterways. These codes did not sweep away the old confusion entirely, but they were a serious attempt to make the rules of the kingdom clearer and more consistent, all of them flowing from a single source of authority, the king. For a time, his efforts paid off. Revenues rose, industry grew, and the French state had more money to spend than it had enjoyed in living memory. The problem was that the king kept finding ways to spend it faster than even Colbert could raise it. Two appetites in particular drained the treasury for the rest of the reign. One was war. The other was a building project that would become the most famous palace in the world. The war machine. If Colbert built the money side of the state, another man built its sword. His name was the Marquis de Louvois, and he served as Louis's Secretary of State for War for much of the reign. Where Colbert was focused on trade and finance, Louvois was focused on turning the French army into the most formidable fighting force in Europe, and the two men were bitter rivals for the king's attention. Before this period, armies across Europe were often messy, half-private affairs, full of units that belonged more to their colonels than to the crown. Louvois worked to change that in France. He pushed to bring the army more firmly under royal control, to standardize how soldiers were equipped and paid, and to impose real discipline. He helped build a system of supply depots so that armies could be fed on campaign instead of simply looting the countryside. He encouraged clearer ranks and a more regular chain of command. Under his management, the French army swelled to a size that earlier generations would have found almost unimaginable, numbering in the hundreds of thousands at its wartime peak. A professional army on this scale needed professional fortifications, and here Louis had the services of one of the greatest military engineers in history, a man named Vauban. Vauban was a soldier, a builder, and a brilliant thinker about the science of attack and defense. He designed and rebuilt a ring of fortresses along France's frontiers, especially in the north and east, creating a defensive belt meant to shield the country from invasion. His star-shaped forts, with their angled walls and overlapping fields of fire, were studied and copied across the world. Vauban was just as skilled at taking fortresses as at building them. He developed a careful, almost mathematical method for besieging an enemy stronghold, digging zigzag trenches ever closer to the walls under cover, so that a siege became a predictable process rather than a bloody gamble. Generals across Europe adopted his methods. For all his genius in war, Vauban also grew troubled by the suffering he saw among ordinary French people, and late in life he wrote a bold proposal for a fairer tax that would fall on everyone, including the privileged. The king was not pleased, and the work was suppressed, a reminder that even Louis's most valued servants could fall out of favor the moment they questioned the order of things. Together, Louvois and Vauban gave Louis a war machine of unmatched power. The question was whether the king could resist the temptation to use it, and the answer, again and again, was no. The pursuit of knowledge. Louis and his ministers understood that prestige did not come only from armies and palaces. It also came from knowledge, and the reign saw a deliberate effort to make France a center of science and learning. In the 1660s, with Colbert's encouragement, the crown founded a Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris. The idea was to gather the best minds in mathematics, astronomy, anatomy, and natural philosophy, to support their work and to harness their discoveries for the benefit of the state. This was science, as a matter of national prestige, funded and protected by the king. A grand observatory was built in Paris so that astronomers could study the heavens with the best instruments available. To stock these institutions, France went shopping for talent across Europe. The crown lured a brilliant Italian astronomer to Paris, where he mapped the surface of the moon, studied the planets, and helped lead the new observatory. France also drew in a famous Dutch scientist, one of the sharpest scientific minds of the age, offering him a generous pension to work in Paris for years. The message was clear. France did not just want to admire genius, it wanted to own it, to gather it under the king's roof, the way it gathered everything else. The work had practical aims as well as glamorous ones. French scientists worked on measuring the size and shape of the Earth more accurately than ever before, and on the difficult problem of fixing positions precisely, which mattered enormously for navigation and for mapping the kingdom. Over time, this effort would produce some of the most accurate maps ever made of any country, transforming a vague sense of where France's towns and roads lay into hard, measured geography. The same hunger for excellence touched the arts and letters. The reign poured money into academies for painting and sculpture, for architecture, for music, and for the French language itself. Writers and playwrights who might once have struggled for patrons now found pensions and protection, so long as their work reflected glory back onto the throne. The result was a flowering of theater, poetry, and music that later ages would call a golden age of French culture. Comedy, tragedy, and opera flourished under royal favor, and the king himself, in his younger years, loved to dance in elaborate court ballets before an audience of awed nobles. Genius in this reign was not left to chance. It was cultivated, rewarded, and pointed firmly in the direction of the crown. This was all part of the same instinct that drove everything else in the reign. Louis wanted France to be first in every field that the world respected, whether that was warfare, art, manners, or the secrets of nature. A king who lit up the sky, after all, ought to understand it. Versailles and the Gilded Cage. A few hours' ride from Paris stood a modest hunting lodge that Louis's father had built in a marshy area called Versailles. Louis loved the spot. Starting in the 1660s and continuing for decades, he transformed that lodge into a palace so vast and so grand that it reshaped the meaning of royal power. The scale is hard to overstate. Armies of workers drained marshes, moved earth, and laid out enormous formal gardens with fountains, canals, and geometric paths stretching to the horizon. The building itself grew into hundreds of rooms, wrapped in marble, gilding, mirrors, and painted ceilings. The most famous space, the Hall of Mirrors, lined one entire gallery with mirror after mirror facing tall windows, so that on a bright day the whole room blazed with reflected light. Getting enough water to feed all those fountains was a massive engineering struggle that was never fully solved, and at one point, The crown built a gigantic and wildly expensive pumping machine on the nearby river just to push water uphill toward the gardens. But Versailles was never just a beautiful house. It was a political weapon, and it was aimed straight at the nobility that had terrified Louis as a child during the Fronde. In the 1680s, Louis made Versailles the permanent center of his court and required the great nobles of France to come and live there with him, at least for much of the year. Once he had them there, he trapped them in an elaborate system of ceremony and competition. Daily life at court revolved around the king's body and routine. There was a formal ceremony for the king waking up in the morning and another for him going to bed at night. The right to hand him his shirt, to hold a candle, or to be present at the right moment became prizes that the highest nobles in the land fought over. Status was measured in tiny gestures and physical closeness to the king. This was genius, and it was cruel. A nobleman, absorbed in chasing the honor of attending the royal bedtime, was a nobleman who was not back in his home province raising an army or plotting against the crown. Louis turned the proudest aristocracy in Europe into a crowd of courtiers who depended on his favor for everything. He could ruin a great family simply by failing to notice it. Here is the broader world those courtiers stood on top of. French society in the late 1600s was officially divided into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, which meant the vast majority of the population. At the top, the great nobles at Versailles dressed in silk, velvet, and lace, in elaborately styled wigs and embroidered coats, with the men often as richly decorated as the women. They dined on rich meats, game, sauces, sugar, and wine, and their days were structured around display, hunting, gambling, and the endless theater of the court. Below them, provincial gentry lived far more plainly. At the bottom, the peasants who made up most of France, worked the land, lived in small village houses, ate a diet built around coarse bread, vegetable soups, and very little meat, and handed over a large share of what they produced in rents, taxes, and church dues. Custom governed everything, from how you dressed to where you could sit in church, and the gap between the gilded halls of Versailles and the mud of a peasant village was almost beyond imagining. The whole point of Louis's court was to make sure the people in that gilded world owed it all to him. The king and his capital. For all the attention Louis lavished on Versailles, he never entirely turned his back on Paris. His relationship with the great city was complicated. He distrusted it deeply after the Fronde, when its mobs had driven him out as a child, and that distrust was part of why he eventually moved his court away from it. Yet he also understood that the capital was the face France showed to the world, and he spent enormous effort making it grander, safer, and more orderly. One of his boldest urban moves was to tear down the old medieval defensive walls that had ringed Paris for centuries. In their place, he created wide, tree-lined avenues, a ring of grand boulevards that opened the city up and announced that, under his protection, Paris no longer needed walls to feel secure. He marked the main entrances to the city with great triumphal arches built in the Roman style, monuments designed to celebrate his military victories and remind every traveler whose reign they were entering. He also reshaped the heart of the city with imposing public squares, laid out with mathematical regularity, and centered on grand statues of the king himself. These spaces were not just decoration. They were statements, turning the everyday streets of Paris into a stage for royal glory. He pushed forward work on the old royal palace in the city as well, adding a famous long colonnade that became a model of French classical architecture. Perhaps the most genuinely humane of his Parisian projects was a vast institution built to house the wounded, aged, and crippled soldiers of his armies. Before this, a veteran broken in the king's wars could easily end his days begging in the gutter. Louis created an enormous complex, crowned by a magnificent golden dome, where such men could live out their lives with food, shelter, and care. It was partly genuine charity and partly clever propaganda, since a king who looked after his old soldiers inspired loyalty in his young ones. He attacked the disorder of the streets themselves. Paris in this era was dark, dangerous, and dirty after nightfall. Louis's government installed thousands of lanterns to light the main streets, and it created an organized, professional police force to keep order, one of the first of its kind in any major European city. The same king who had fled the Parisian mob as a boy now controlled the city's nights with lamplight and patrols. So even as Versailles drew the court away, Paris itself was being rebuilt as a monument to the reign. Louis wanted the capital to dazzle visitors and to project the image of a calm, powerful, orderly kingdom. The boy who had been chased through its streets in the dark grew into the king who lit them, building the Sunday. Louis did not just want power. He wanted to be seen, understood, and remembered in a very particular way. He became, in effect, the most carefully managed public image of his age. The central symbol was the sun. Louis adopted the sun as his personal emblem, casting himself as the source of light and life for the whole kingdom, the fixed point around which everything else revolved. This is the origin of the nickname that stuck to him forever, the Sun King. The imagery appeared everywhere, on medals, in paintings, in sculpture, and in the design of Versailles itself. To control his image, Louis poured resources into the arts and bent them toward the glory of the crown. He supported royal academies that set the official standards for painting, sculpture, architecture, and more. He kept a stable of artists and writers whose work, directly or indirectly, served to magnify the king. Painters produced grand portraits, showing him as a godlike figure of authority. The official histories told the story of his reign as a chain of triumphs. The court also became the center of a remarkable burst of French culture. The composer, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, created a distinctly French style of opera and dominated court music for years. The playwright Molière wrote sharp comedies that skewered the pretensions of society, often performed for the king himself. The tragic dramatist Jean Racine produced some of the most admired plays in the French language. Louis enjoyed the spectacle, and as a younger man he loved to perform, dancing in elaborate court ballets, sometimes literally costumed as the sun. All of this served a purpose. A king who controlled the culture controlled how he would be remembered, and Louis intended to be remembered as the greatest monarch France had ever produced. Even fashion bent to his image. Louis popularized high-heeled shoes for men, and he was especially fond of heels with bright red soles. At his court, those red heels became a status symbol, and the privilege of wearing them was effectively reserved for nobles in the king's favor. If your heels were red, everyone in the room knew exactly where you stood. Monsieur, the king's brother. No account of the reign is complete without the strange and revealing story of Louis's younger brother, Philippe, known at court by the simple title of Monsieur. From childhood, Philippe had been raised with a single overriding goal in mind: that he should never become a rival to his older brother. The lesson of the Fronde, when ambitious royal relatives had nearly torn France apart, was fresh, and those around the young Philippe deliberately steered him away from politics and war and toward gentler, less threatening pursuits. The result was one of the most colorful figures of the age. Philippe became famous for his love of fashion, jewels, perfume, and elaborate ceremony, and he made little secret of his romantic interest in other men, surrounding himself with male favorites in a way that scandalized some and amused others. To many observers, he seemed the very picture of a court dandy, more interested in his appearance than in anything serious. That picture turned out to be misleading. Philippe married twice. His first wife was an English princess, whose sudden and mysterious death set off wild rumors of poisoning. His second wife was a blunt, plain-spoken German princess from the Palatinate, a woman with no patience for court flattery, whose enormous output of frank, gossipy letters survives today as one of the richest windows we have into daily life at Louis's court. The greatest surprise of Philippe's life came on the battlefield. Despite being kept away from military command for most of his career, he was given a chance to lead an army during one of the wars, and he seized it brilliantly. In a hard-fought battle, Philippe personally led French forces to a decisive victory over none other than William of Orange, the king's most dogged enemy. It was a genuine triumph, the kind of military glory that any prince would treasure. Louis's reaction told you everything about the man and his reign. Rather than reward his brother's success, the king appears to have grown uneasy at the sight of a royal relative winning fame on the battlefield, exactly the kind of figure the Fronde had taught him to fear. Philippe was quietly never given an important command again. He spent the rest of his life as the glittering, slightly frustrated second man of the kingdom, close to the throne, but forever kept from real power. The brothers argued, sometimes bitterly, but the bond between them held until the end. And in a final irony, it was Philippe's line, the House of Orléans, that would go on to play a major role in French history long after Louis's own direct descendants had faltered. The brother who was raised to be harmless left a mark on France that lasted for centuries. France across the oceans. The reach of Louis's France did not stop at the edges of Europe. While the king built his palace and fought his neighbors, French explorers, traders, and settlers were pushing out across the wider world, and a colonial empire was taking shape in his name. In North America, French power centered on the territory then called New France, in what is now Canada. The colony was built largely around the fur trade, with French traders and missionaries pushing deep into the interior and forming alliances with native nations. During Louis's reign, explorers ventured down the great river systems of the continent. One famous expedition followed the Mississippi River far to the south, and a later explorer traveled all the way to where the river met the sea, claiming the entire vast drainage basin for France. He named this enormous interior territory Louisiana, directly in honor of the king. A huge stretch of the middle of North America thus carried Louis's name long before most Europeans had any idea what was actually there. In the Caribbean, France held a cluster of immensely profitable sugar islands. These colonies generated staggering wealth, but that wealth rested on one of the cruelest systems in human history: the enslavement of large numbers of Africans who were forced to labor and die on the plantations. In 1685, the same year as one of the most fateful decisions of his reign at home, Louis's government issued a notorious legal code regulating slavery in the French colonies. It treated enslaved human beings as property and laid out their conditions in chilling detail. It is a part of the story of the reign that the glittering image of Versailles was designed to make people forget. France also reached toward Asia. A French trading company established footholds in India, including a settlement that would remain a French outpost for centuries. Across the globe, France was now competing directly with the Dutch and the English for trade, territory, and the riches of distant continents. The rivalry on the oceans mirrored the rivalry in Europe, and it planted the seeds of struggles that would outlast Louis by generations. For Louis himself, the colonies were mostly a distant matter, less interesting than a battlefield in the Low Countries or a new wing of his palace. But the empire built during his reign would shape the history of entire continents, for good and very much for ill, long after the Sun King was gone. The women of the reign. Behind the public glory ran a tangled private life, and the women in it shaped the court in ways that mattered far beyond the bedroom. Louis's marriage to Maria Theresa produced an heir, but little affection. For most of his adult life, the king kept official mistresses, women whose position was openly acknowledged at court and who could wield real influence. The first great love of his early reign was Louise de la Vallière, a gentle and somewhat reluctant young woman who bore him several children and was eventually pushed aside. She later withdrew from court entirely and became a nun, doing penance for years. Her replacement was a very different kind of woman. Madame de Montespan was beautiful, witty, ambitious, and proud. For more than a decade, she was the dazzling, unofficial queen of the court, bearing the king a large family of illegitimate children, whom Louis later legitimized and folded into the royal family. Montespan's reign over the king's affections seemed unshakable until it was shaken by scandal. In the late 1670s, France was rocked by what became known as the Affair of the Poisons. A criminal investigation into fortune tellers and poison sellers in Paris spiraled outward and began to touch members of the court. There were accusations of poison plots, secret ceremonies, and worse. Montespan's name became dangerously entangled in the rumors, with claims that she had used potions and dark rituals to keep the king's love. Nothing was ever definitively proven against her, and Louis shut down the most damaging parts of the inquiry. But her standing never fully recovered. The woman who finally replaced her brought the whole story to a surprising close. Madame de Maintenon had originally come to court as the governess for the king's illegitimate children. She was intelligent, pious, and serious, the opposite of the glittering Montespan. Over time, Louis came to depend on her completely. After Maria Theresa died in 1683, Louis secretly married Maintenon. The marriage was never publicly announced and she was never made queen, but she remained his constant companion for the rest of his life. Under her influence, the aging king grew steadily more religious and more austere, and the light-hearted spectacle of the early court gave way to something quieter and far more devout. That growing religious seriousness was about to drive one of the most consequential decisions of the entire reign. One king, one faith. Louis believed that a strong kingdom needed unity, and to his mind, unity meant one king, one law, and one faith. That conviction collided with a community of French Protestants known as the Huguenots. To understand the stakes, we have to go back. France had suffered through brutal religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in the previous century. Those wars were finally calmed by a famous decree called the Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598 by Louis's grandfather, Henry IV. The edict granted the Huguenots a measure of religious freedom and legal protection. It allowed them to worship in certain places and gave them a defined position within an officially Catholic kingdom. For most of a century, it held an uneasy peace. Louis disliked this arrangement intensely. A separate Protestant community inside Catholic France offended both his religion and his idea of total unity under the crown. At first, he chipped away at Huguenot rights with a slow campaign of restrictions, closing their churches, barring them from professions, and pressuring them to convert. The pressure turned harsh. The crown began quartering rough soldiers in Protestant homes, a practice designed to terrorize families into changing their faith. Then, in 1685, Louis took the final step. He revoked the Edict of Nantes entirely. With one decree, Protestantism lost its legal protection in France. Huguenot churches were ordered destroyed, their schools closed, and their ministers expelled. Ordinary Protestants were forbidden to leave the country and pushed relentlessly to convert to Catholicism. The decision was popular with many Catholics in France at the time, who celebrated the king as a defender of the true faith, but it was a serious blunder in practical terms. Despite the ban on emigration, somewhere around 200,000 Huguenots managed to flee France in the years that followed. They were often skilled artisans, merchants, soldiers, and professionals, exactly the kind of productive people a country wants to keep. They carried their skills and their money to France's rivals, including the Dutch Republic, England, the Protestant German states, and beyond. France weakened itself and strengthened its enemies, all in the name of religious unity. In a rugged region of southern France, the persecution later sparked an armed uprising among Protestant peasants, who waged a stubborn guerrilla resistance against royal troops for years. Louis also clashed with the Pope over control of the French Church, and tangled with a strict Catholic movement called Jansenism, which he distrusted and tried to stamp out. In every case, the pattern was the same. The king wanted religious life in France to bend to his authority. He got his unity, but the cost was high, and the bitterness it created would echo for generations. The marshals. Louis loved to be portrayed as a conquering warrior king, and many paintings show him on horseback directing battles. The truth is that the real fighting genius of his early wars belonged to a small number of brilliant commanders, and Louis's relationship with them revealed the deep suspicion of powerful subjects that the Fronde had planted in him. The two greatest were a study in contrast. One was the Prince of Condé, often remembered as the Great Condé, a dazzling and aggressive battlefield commander who had won spectacular victories while still a young man. The other was a marshal named Turenne, a calmer, more patient master of maneuver and strategy, widely regarded as one of the finest generals of the age. Both men carried complicated histories with the crown. During the chaos of the Fronde, the Great Condé had actually turned against the royal government and, at one point, fought on the side of Spain against his own king. That betrayal was eventually forgiven, and Condé returned to lead French armies once more, but Louis never entirely forgot who he was dealing with. Turenne, for his part, had also wavered during the Fronde before committing firmly to the royal cause, after which he became the steady backbone of French military success. In the wars of the 1670s, these commanders carried French arms to victory after victory. Turenne, in particular, conducted campaigns that military students would study for centuries, outmaneuvering larger enemy forces with speed and cunning. His career ended on the battlefield when he was killed by a cannon shot while scouting enemy positions, a loss that shook the entire French command. Louis valued these men, rewarded them, and depended on them. But he also made sure that ultimate control always rested with the crown and never with any single general, no matter how brilliant. As the older generation of commanders passed away, the king increasingly relied on officials and managers like Louvois to run the war effort, and on a new crop of generals who owed their positions entirely to royal favor. It was the same instinct that drove the whole reign. Talent was welcome, as long as it never grew strong enough to stand on its own. The web of diplomacy. Louis did not project French power through armies alone. Behind the wars ran a vast and sophisticated machine of diplomacy, and in many ways, it was as important as anything that happened on a battlefield. France under Louis built one of the most professional diplomatic services in Europe. The crown kept resident ambassadors in foreign capitals, maintained networks of informants, and treated the gathering of information about rival courts as a serious branch of statecraft. French agents worked to influence elections, alliances, and successions all across the continent, often with bags of money. Bribery was simply a tool of the trade. The French treasury paid secret pensions to influential courtiers, ministers, and even monarchs in other countries, buying friends and softening enemies without ever drawing a sword. The most striking example involved England. In the years before the Dutch War, Louis reached a secret understanding with the English king, who agreed to align with France in exchange for substantial payments of French money. The arrangement let Louis rent the cooperation of a major rival power and turn it, at least for a time, against his Dutch enemies. It was diplomacy as a business transaction, and Louis was very good at it. He was also willing to deal with powers that other Christian rulers considered beyond the pale. France cultivated relations with the Ottoman Empire, the great Muslim power to the east, because a strong Ottoman presence kept pressure on Louis's Austrian Habsburg rivals. This willingness to cooperate with the Ottomans for the sake of French advantage scandalized much of Catholic Europe, and his enemies accused him of betraying Christendom itself for cold political gain. Louis did not particularly care. French interest came first, and he pursued it wherever it led. There was one quiet triumph in all of this that outlasted every treaty and every battle. During Louis's reign, the French language steadily replaced Latin as the working language of diplomacy across Europe. Negotiations, treaties, and the conversation of educated courts increasingly happened in French. Long after Louis's armies had been beaten and his treasury drained, French remained the common tongue of diplomats and elites for generations. It was perhaps the most durable form of dominance he ever achieved, one not with cannon, but with culture. Taken together, the diplomacy of the reign reveals a ruler who understood power in all its forms. Louis could be a warrior when he chose, but he was just as comfortable working through money, marriage, information, and prestige. He treated the whole of Europe as a single great game board, and for decades he was the most skillful player at the table. The hunger for glory, war, was the other great appetite of the reign, and Louis pursued it again and again. He genuinely believed that military glory was the highest expression of a great king, and he wanted to expand France's borders, especially toward the north and east. His first major war of aggression came in 1667, often called the War of Devolution. Using a legal argument based on his wife's family claims and that unpaid Spanish dowry, Louis sent his armies into the Spanish-controlled territory in the Low Countries. French forces did well, but the rapid gains alarmed France's neighbors. A coalition formed to check him, and Louis settled for a modest set of territorial gains rather than risk everything. He was not satisfied for long. He blamed the Dutch Republic in particular for organizing resistance to him, and he set out to punish it. In 1672, he launched the Dutch War, sending a powerful army crashing into the Netherlands. At first, the invasion was a stunning success, and the Dutch were nearly overwhelmed. In desperation, the Dutch opened their dikes and deliberately flooded their own land to stop the French advance. The crisis brought to power a determined young Dutch leader, William of Orange, who would become Louis's most persistent enemy for the rest of his life. The war widened as other powers joined against France, and it dragged on for years before ending with another treaty that gave Louis more territory, including the important region of Franche-Comté. Between the formal wars, Louis kept pushing his borders outward through a process backed by special legal courts that he set up to find old claims to neighboring lands. Wherever such a claim could be argued, French troops moved in to occupy the territory. Through these maneuvers, he seized a number of border towns and regions, most famously the city of Strasbourg, which French forces took in 1681. To his neighbors, this looked like naked aggression dressed up in legal paperwork, and it deepened the fear and resentment building against him across Europe. By the 1680s, Louis stood at the peak of his power. France was the dominant military land power on the continent. Its armies were the largest and best organized in Europe, and its king was both admired and feared. It is worth pausing on just how large that war effort had become. The professional standing army Louis maintained was bigger than anything Western Europe had seen since the days of ancient Rome, numbering in the hundreds of thousands when fully mobilized. Feeding, paying, arming, and moving such a force was a colossal undertaking that consumed a huge share of the kingdom's wealth year after year, in peace as well as war. The sheer scale of it changed warfare across the continent, forcing rival states to expand and reorganize their own armies just to keep pace. Europe was entering an age of mass professional armies, and Louis's France had led the way into it. But his relentless expansion had a predictable effect. It frightened everyone else into banding together, and the second half of his reign would be defined by long, grinding wars against grand coalitions that France could not easily overcome. The 9 Years' War. In 1688, Louis's ambitions ran into a wall built from nearly every major power in Europe. The conflict that followed is usually called the 9 Years' War, and it grew out of the deep alarm that Louis's expansion had created. A broad alliance came together against him, eventually including the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and many German states, Spain, Savoy, and, crucially, England. The English peace was especially important, because in this very period his old rival William of Orange seized the English throne and threw the resources of England into the struggle against France. This was a different kind of war from Louis's earlier triumphs. It was long, expensive, and fought on multiple fronts at once, on land in the Low Countries and along the German frontier, and at sea. France was strong, and its armies won important battles, but it was now facing the combined weight of much of the continent. The fighting settled into a brutal grind of sieges, marches, and the slow exhaustion of money and men. In one particularly notorious episode, French forces deliberately devastated a stretch of German territory along the Rhine, burning towns and laying waste to the land in a scorched earth campaign that horrified Europe and hardened opinion against Louis even further. The financial strain was severe. Years of warfare on this scale drained the treasury that Colbert had worked so hard to build, and Colbert himself had died back in 1683. The crown resorted to desperate measures to raise cash, including selling offices and titles and melting down silver furniture and ornaments at Versailles. The glittering objects that had advertised the king's wealth went into the fire to pay his soldiers. The war finally ended in 1697 with a peace treaty in which Louis, for the first time, was forced to give ground. He had to return much of what he had grabbed through his border courts, although he held on to Strasbourg. Just as important, he formally recognized William of Orange as the rightful king of England, abandoning the rival claimant he had been supporting. After decades of expansion, Louis had been checked. France was intact but worn down, and the king was no longer the unstoppable force he had seemed a decade earlier. The peace did not last. Within a few years, an even greater war was coming, and this one would be fought over the richest inheritance in Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession. The last great war of Louis's reign was triggered by a death in another royal family, and it nearly undid everything he had built. The King of Spain, Charles II, was a sickly and childless man whose body had been ruined by generations of royal inbreeding. For years, the powers of Europe had worried about what would happen when he died, because Spain was not just a country. It was a vast empire that included territory in Italy, the Low Countries, and an enormous colonial domain in the Americas. Whoever inherited that empire would tip the balance of power across the world. Both Louis and the Austrian Habsburgs had family claims to the Spanish throne, since both had married Spanish princesses. To avoid a catastrophic war, diplomats had tried to arrange a partition of the Spanish inheritance in advance. But when Charles II finally died in 1700, his will threw out those plans. He left the entire Spanish Empire, undivided, to Louis's grandson, a young prince named Philip. Louis faced a genuine dilemma. If he refused the inheritance, it would likely pass to the Austrian rival, leaving France encircled. If he accepted it, the rest of Europe would never tolerate the union of French and Spanish power under one family. Louis accepted. His grandson became King Philip V of Spain. To reassure the world, it was said that the two crowns would remain separate. But Louis then made several moves that suggested otherwise, including steps that hinted Philip might one day also have rights in France. That was enough. A familiar coalition formed against him, once again led by England, the Dutch, and the Austrians. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed, beginning in earnest in 1701, was the largest and most punishing conflict of the entire reign. It was fought across Europe by huge professional armies, and this time France's enemies had brilliant commanders. The Allied forces, led by figures such as the English commander, the Duke of Marlborough, and the Austrian general Prince Eugene of Savoy, inflicted a string of crushing defeats on French armies in major battles, including a disaster deep in German lands that shattered the myth of French invincibility. For a few terrible years, it looked as though France itself might be invaded and dismembered. The country was exhausted, taxed to the breaking point, and struck by a catastrophic winter in 1709 that froze rivers, killed crops, and brought famine and mass death. Louis, now an old man, even appealed directly to his people for support in a public letter, an extraordinary step for a king who had spent his life insisting that his authority came from God alone. In one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, fought in that same desperate period, the French army lost the field, but inflicted such terrible casualties on the advancing Allies that the enemy could not press on to invade France itself. In the end, France survived, partly through sheer endurance, and partly because the alliance against it began to crack apart over its own disagreements. The war wound down with a series of treaties signed in the years around 1713 and 1714. The outcome was a compromise. Louis's grandson Philip kept the throne of Spain and its overseas empire, which was a real prize for the family. But Philip had to renounce any claim to the French throne, so that the two crowns could never be combined. Spain also lost its European possessions outside Spain itself, which were carved up among the victors, and England came away with valuable territory and trading rights that helped launch its rise as a global power. Louis had secured a Bourbon king in Spain, and his grandson's descendants would rule there for a very long time. But the cost had been staggering. France was financially shattered, its population battered, and the king's dream of total dominance over Europe was dead. The price paid by the people. The glory of the reign was real, and so was its cost, and that cost was paid overwhelmingly by people whose names history did not record. Behind every campaign and every wing of the palace stood a tax system that pressed hardest on those who had the least. The backbone of royal revenue was a direct land tax, from which the nobility and much of the clergy were largely exempt by ancient privilege. That meant the weight of it fell on the common people, the farmers and townsfolk who could least afford to give up what little they had. On top of it sat a hated tax on salt, an essential of daily life, enforced so harshly that smuggling and resistance were constant. And whenever a new war demanded money, which was often, fresh levies were piled on top of the old ones. Late in the reign, under the crushing pressure of war finance, Louis's government did attempt something genuinely new. It introduced a head tax assessed across the population, and later an income-based tax, both of which were supposed, on paper, to reach even the privileged orders who had always escaped the main land tax. In principle, this was a striking break with centuries of tradition. In practice, the wealthiest and best connected found ways to soften or dodge the blow, and the burden still landed mostly on ordinary subjects. Then came hunger. In the middle of the 1690s, a series of failed harvests combined with savage weather to produce one of the worst famines in French history. Grain prices soared beyond the reach of the poor, and across large parts of the country people starved or died of the diseases that prey on the weakened. The death toll ran well into the hundreds of thousands and may have reached beyond 1 million, a catastrophe unfolding in the same years that the court still expected its taxes paid in full to fund the war. The suffering boiled over into resistance. In various regions, peasants and townspeople rose up against tax collectors and royal officials, sometimes in large and violent revolts. The crown answered these uprisings with force, sending troops to crush them and punish the leaders, because a state built on absolute royal authority could not tolerate open defiance, however desperate its cause. This is the shadow side of the Sun King's France. While ambassadors marveled at the fountains of Versailles and the brilliance of the court, much of the country lived close to the edge, taxed to fund wars it did not choose, and palaces it would never see. The grandeur and the misery were not separate stories. They were the same story, seen from opposite ends of the kingdom. The man behind the mask. For someone who lived his entire life in public, surrounded at every hour by courtiers watching his every move, Louis XIV remains in some ways hard to know. He had made his own person into an institution, and the mask of majesty rarely slipped, but the records left by those around him do reveal something of the human being underneath. By all accounts, he had iron self-control. He was unfailingly polite, even to servants, and he almost never lost his temper in public, no matter the provocation. He kept to a rigid daily schedule that almost never varied, so precise that people said you could set a clock by the king's movements. He had an extraordinary memory, especially for faces, ranks, and the endless details of who stood where in the pecking order of his court, and he used that memory as a tool of control, since a single cold word or a pointed silence from him could make or break a career. In his younger years, he was physically vigorous and athletic. He adored hunting, riding, and dancing, and he had an enormous capacity for the long hours of governing that he imposed on himself. That robust body, however, was steadily worn down by the brutal medicine of the age. His doctors subjected him to endless bleedings, purges, and treatments that often did more harm than good. He lost most of his teeth relatively early, partly thanks to a disastrous dental procedure that damaged his jaw and left him with chronic problems. The most famous medical ordeal of his life came when he developed a painful condition that required major surgery in a region of the body no one liked to discuss. There was, of course, no real anesthesia. The operation was an agonizing risk, and the entire court held its breath. The surgeon, working on the most important patient in the world, performed it successfully, and the king's recovery was followed obsessively by the whole of Versailles. The man who carried out the procedure became famous, and for a time it was almost fashionable at court to claim to suffer from the same ailment as the king. Through all of it, Louis kept governing. Even in old age, racked by gout and the accumulated wear of his treatments, he sat through his councils, read his reports, and held to his routine. His religious devotion deepened steadily as he aged, encouraged by his pious secret wife, and the carefree pleasures of his youth gave way to a grave, disciplined seriousness. What emerges is a portrait of a man of immense willpower who had, in a real sense, disappeared into his own role. He had spent so many decades being the king, every waking moment, that the private person and the public institution had grown almost impossible to separate. That was exactly what he had set out to achieve. He wanted to be France itself, and by the end, in his own mind and in the eyes of his subjects, he very nearly was. Outliving his family, while the great wars raged, Louis suffered a private series of blows that were, in their own way, just as devastating. In the space of a few short years, near the end of his life, he watched his direct heirs die one after another. For most of the reign, the succession had looked secure. Louis had a healthy son, the Grand Dauphin, who in turn had sons of his own. Below them stretched what looked like a safe line of male heirs. Then the line began to collapse. In 1711, the Grand Dauphin, Louis's only legitimate son to survive childhood, died of smallpox. The crown's hopes shifted to the Dauphin's eldest son, the Duke of Burgundy, a thoughtful young man whom many saw as a promising future king. But the following year, in 1712, a wave of illness swept through the family. The Duke of Burgundy died, his wife died, and their eldest little boy died as well, all within a matter of days and weeks. It was an almost unbelievable run of loss. In about a year, the old king had lost his son, his grandson, his granddaughter-in-law, and a great-grandson. The throne of France now rested on the survival of a single, sickly toddler, the younger son of the Duke of Burgundy, who had barely escaped the same illness. Louis understood that his entire dynasty, the family he had spent a lifetime glorifying, was hanging by the thinnest possible thread. The personal grief of these years was immense, and the once vigorous king grew tired, sad, and old. The court, which had begun as a place of dazzling spectacle, had become a somber place, ruled over by an aging man in mourning and his devout secret wife. There was one more shadow over the succession. Because the legitimate line had nearly vanished, Louis took steps late in life to raise the status of his legitimized, illegitimate sons, giving them rights that could place them near the throne in an emergency. This decision would be bitterly contested after his death and would help set off a struggle for control once he was gone. The death of the Sun King. By the summer of 1715, Louis XIV was 76 years old and had reigned for 72 of those years. His body was finally failing him. A wound on his leg turned gangrenous, and the doctors of the day could do nothing to stop the infection spreading through his body. Louis faced his death with a calm dignity that impressed those around him. He had spent his whole life performing the role of king, and he performed his final act with the same control. He set his affairs in order, said his farewells, and gave advice to the tiny great-grandson who would succeed him. In one of those final conversations, the old king reportedly warned the child not to copy his own love of war and lavish building, telling the boy to live in peace with his neighbors and to lighten the burden on his people. It was a remarkable admission from a man who had spent decades doing the opposite. Whether the words are exactly accurate or polished by later memory, they capture a king looking back and seeing the price of his ambitions. Louis XIV died on the 1st of September, 1715, just a few days short of his 77th birthday. His great-grandson, a 5-year-old boy, became King Louis XV. There is a strange and grisly footnote to his death. Following royal custom, the king's body was divided after death, with his heart and other organs removed and preserved separately in containers, a practice common for monarchs of the age. More than a century later, during the chaos of the French Revolution, many such royal remains were disturbed. The preserved heart of Louis XIV passed through various hands over the years, and according to a famous and well-documented anecdote, it ended up in the collection of an eccentric English clergyman known for eating unusual things, who is said to have actually consumed part of it. The Sun King, who had once filled the sky over France, ended in the most undignified way imaginable. The reaction to his death revealed how the country really felt. The reign had ended in war, debt, famine, and exhaustion. When the funeral procession passed through the area outside Paris, reports described crowds that were not mourning but in some places jeering and celebrating, relieved that the long, heavy reign was finally over. The same people who had been taught to see him as the radiant center of the world were glad to see the burden lifted. When the sun set, the death of so dominant a king instantly threw France into a scramble for power, and what happened in the weeks after his passing showed just how much had been held together by his single will. Louis had tried to control events from beyond the grave, fearing for the safety of his tiny great-grandson and distrusting his closest adult relative. He had drawn up a will that hedged the powers of the coming regency and, crucially, gave a strong position to his legitimized sons, the children born of his mistresses whom he had earlier raised toward the steps of the throne. He hoped this arrangement would protect the boy king and preserve the structure he had built. It collapsed almost at once. The natural candidate to govern for the child was the late king's nephew, the Duke of Orleans, the son of Louis's brother Philippe. Within days of the old king's death, this man went before the high court in Paris, the very kind of body Louis had spent his life trying to tame, and had the will effectively overturned. He secured full powers as regent for himself, and soon moved to strip the legitimized sons of the special rights Louis had granted them. The carefully drawn plans of the dying king were swept aside in a matter of weeks. The mood of the country changed just as fast. The long reign had ended in war, debt, and grief, and many people were simply relieved that it was over. The new regent relaxed the austere, gloomy atmosphere that had settled over the court in Louis's final years under the influence of his devout secret wife, who now withdrew quietly from public life. The center of fashionable life drifted back toward Paris. A lighter, more pleasure-seeking spirit returned almost as a reaction against the heavy seriousness of the old king's last decades. But the deeper problems Louis had left behind could not be relaxed away. The treasury was empty, and the crown was buried under a mountain of debt, accumulated through a lifetime of war and building. The Regency soon gambled on a daring and ultimately disastrous financial scheme that briefly promised to wipe out the debt and then collapsed in spectacular fashion, wiping out fortunes and shaking confidence in the whole financial system. It was an early warning that the machinery of the absolute state, so impressive on the surface, was carrying strains it could not easily bear. The child on the throne would grow up to reign for a very long time himself, but he inherited a structure that was already showing deep cracks. The Sun King had set, and the long twilight of his system had begun. What Louis left behind. The legacy of Louis XIV is a study in spectacular success, sitting right next to spectacular failure, and both parts are real. On one side of the ledger, he genuinely transformed the French monarchy. He took a kingdom that had nearly fallen apart in his childhood and built a centralized state with the king at its absolute center. He tamed a dangerous nobility, turning would-be rebels into courtiers. He made France the leading power in Europe for much of his reign and set the cultural standard for the entire continent. French became the language of courts and diplomacy across Europe. French art, architecture, fashion, and manners were imitated everywhere, and Versailles became the model that other rulers desperately tried to copy. For generations, to be sophisticated in Europe meant, in large part, to imitate the France that Louis had built. On the other side, the costs were enormous, and they outlasted him. His endless wars drained the country and left the crown buried in debt. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes cost France many of its most productive citizens and handed their talents to its rivals. The crushing tax burden fell hardest on the people least able to bear it, while the privileged escaped much of it, baking deep unfairness into the system. And the model of absolute, sacred kingship that he perfected was rigid and unaccountable, dependent entirely on the wisdom of whoever happened to wear the crown. His successors inherited all of this. The debt kept growing, the unfair tax system stayed in place, and the gap between the gilded court and the struggling population kept widening. Within 3 generations, that combination would help ignite the French Revolution, which swept away the very monarchy that Louis had raised to its peak. In a sense, the absolute power he built so carefully contained the seeds of its own destruction. That is the paradox of the Sun King. He was, by the standards of his own age, an extraordinarily successful ruler who achieved nearly everything he set out to do. He also pushed his methods so far that he helped set his own dynasty on the road to the guillotine. He shines, and he warns at the same time, which is exactly why, 300 years later, we are still talking about him. If you made it all the way here, you now understand the Sun King better than almost anyone you will ever meet. There is another video waiting on screen right now, and that one is next. If this was worth your time, a like or a subscribe tells me to keep making them. Thanks for watching.